Hello and welcome to part 4 of this mini-series on decision analysis for agricultural development. I'm Cory Whitney and you've made it to part 4 of the mini-series. If you've missed any of the others, please go back. You'll find them here in the same channel. In part 4, I'm going to talk about biases. It's one of my favorite parts of this series. It's the time to think about what hinders us in our ability to generate conceptual understandings, have a holistic perspective, and what hinders us also in the ability to generate confidence intervals for variables of importance. So I hope you enjoy. I look forward to hearing what you come up with at the end of this lecture, and I look forward to hearing from you in the Slack and through other channels, and we'll see each other soon. In this mini part of the mini series, we'll be talking about overcoming biases. And if you haven't seen the others, go back and look forward to 2 more case studies and conclusions. So when we're applying decision analysis methodologies, we have to consider cognitive biases. These can get in the way of model building. I consider them the bottleneck in the model development process. But also being aware of these biases can help us do a really good job or do a better job of building realistic causal networks and also avoid some of the possible issues in doing that. So I'm going to provide here not cautionary tales for children, but cautionary tales for model developers. Cognitive biases are everywhere around us. One of them that's most common, probably, or most commonly known, is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Unskilled and unaware of it, we feel that we're more knowledgeable the less we know. Unfortunately, this is prevalent, especially in politics in many parts of the world, or possibly just politics in general. So as our, from initially learning until knowing just a very little bit, our confidence jumps from 0 to 100. And then over time, our confidence slowly diminishes until we end up somewhere here in the middle of this loop, which is the pit of despair for some academics. This is where we go when we realize, wow, the problem was much more complicated than I thought. Actually, I don't know as much as I thought I did. The example that I use that helps me understand this concept is building a bicycle or understanding the functioning of a bicycle. So most people would say if they've ridden a bicycle just a few times or they know how to ride a bicycle, they would say, yeah, it's relatively simple. I know a lot. But if they're asked to draw a picture of a bicycle, they generally can't, really. These are just ordinary citizens who claim to have good skill in bicycle or high bicycle knowledge. They knew about bicycles, but they couldn't really draw a functioning bicycle. Whereas someone who is an expert would tell you, they might give their confidence level rather lower. They would say, well, I've built a few bicycles and I know that it has, thousands of moving parts. They all have to be ergonomic and just the right kinds of metals, the right hardness of metal, positioned in the right way. And in order for the bicycle to function, these all have to be really carefully manufactured. I know, less. They would tell you that they know less than the person who maybe knows how to ride a bicycle very well, but their actual expertise is much higher. There's an artist in Italy who takes those drawings from people or takes these ideas from people about how they think a bicycle is structured, and then he builds them. Gianluca Gimini. So there's an art installation you can see where there are all the bicycles that people drew, and you can see that none of them you could possibly ride. If you sit on the seat of this bike, you'll just fall over backwards. One researcher I really like who deals with some of these issues is a psychologist at the Australian National University, Yun Shu. She spoke to our group earlier this year. And she has a Cloudy Shoe WordPress website, which is definitely worth checking out. And she talks a lot about how somebody's confidence can actually derail. So if we get somebody in a group and that person has very low knowledge, high confidence, they can influence the rest of the people in this group, even if those other people are actually experts, because those experts will have rather lower confidence and be more easily swayed by the ideas from those highly confident people. This phenomena is fantastic. It was really astounding. I don't know if it's good. It's not a good thing. Can be a frustrating thing, and we have to find ways to overcome this effect. So, and we call this the fox and the hedgehog. So the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And the way I think about the fox and the hedgehog in this case is that the fox is the scientist, the one who maybe has studied the phenomena, the engineer, the economist. They know enough about it to be able to say, oh, it's very complex. Let me tell you something about the complexity of this problem. Whereas the hedgehog just knows one big thing, that is escape from predation. And the hedgehog will just say, definitely 70%, or definitely building a bicycle is simple, we will do it easily. When in fact, it's of course very complex, and 70% could not possibly be the right number unless we're suddenly very lucky to guess 70% and to get it like that. But of course, there's some uncertainty there. Anchoring is another cognitive bias that plays a big role in our society and in our human interaction. So if there's a barter situation going on, people want to trade, then you may know this from if you've ever been to a flea market, the first person to give a number, the first person to suggest what the units are or how much they're expecting really sets the tone for the rest of the exchange. So they will be the ones who guide the rest of the process. And really, if someone tells you they want €5 and you were thinking 50, you won't go back to closer to your original 50, but instead, if you're bartering, will stay somewhere around the €5 that they've suggested. And if the baker wants 20 pounds of grain, 20 kilos of grain, then it's going to be hard to get down to as a farmer, to get down to your level, which you thought was more realistic, which was like 3 kilos of grain. Daniel Kahneman, we talked about him earlier. His work deals a lot with this, and you can check out his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. If you haven't already, then you are very lucky, because it is a fantastic read. I wish I could read it again for the first time. It's really fun and really interesting. Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for his work together with his co-author Tversky, and it's a really fun thing to read. Another common bias that follows us everywhere we go is confirmation bias. So people will look for, and when I say people, I mean all of us do this. We look for information that confirms our prior beliefs. And we interpret the things that we do find so that they do confirm our prior beliefs already. So out there in the world, we may find lots of information. We may find some things that are facts. The things that are facts are often undervalued. The things that confirm our prior beliefs, if we only focused on those, that would of course be foolish, but we're often somewhere here in between. We overvalue this portion of the things that are out there in the world, the information we can find. So when we find a fact and it confirms our prior belief, we tend to ignore the rest of the facts and just focus on those. And it's much like this. We shoot the arrow, and then we start painting the bullseye around it later. You'll find these pundits who go on television and say 70% and 20% and the economy will go up and down and this and that and explain the whole thing. They'll only really start painting the bullseye around those things that they got correct. I find they're actually not all that accurate in the long run. One example of this, if you want to have some fun with data, then I recommend visiting Spurious Correlations. Tyler Vegan has put together a bunch of these, and this one I like because it's about my home state of Maine. And it says here, it shows here the divorce rate over time. So in Maine, the divorce rate has been going down. And the per capita consumption of margarine, you can see on here on the right-hand axis, the margarine consumed, that's the black line, is also going down. So the obvious, the obvious conclusion that we can come to here is that less margarine consumption, so less margarine consumed. Margarine is disgusting stuff, by the way, so this seems to make sense to me. So I can now, based on my prior belief that margarine is gross, I can say, I can somehow support my feeling that the grossness of margarine has such a major effect on society that actually the less we consume, the less we get divorced. So something to consider. That this, of course, has no bearing whatsoever. There's no causal relationship between margarine consumption and divorce rates. If you visit Spurious Correlations, you'll find a lot more. But what we do is we look at data, just like I did now with my margarine bias. And I said, you see, margarine, less divorce. So yeah, consider that. There's also something called the framing effect. You'll find this a lot in the news. The news, I heard somebody in Georgia say, they shouldn't call it the news, they should just call it the bad news. Because essentially that's what it is. They look for things that you basically shouldn't worry about that are terrible and make them front page so that it's the thing you worry about the most. And an example, several examples of this, not the news necessarily, but our perception of the world and the actual state of the world, what the data says. Lots of these are laid out in Hans Rosling's book, the one I talked about earlier, published posthumously, Factfulness. Fantastic read. If you haven't yet, I do recommend picking up a copy and reading that book as soon as you can. Excellent book. But what we're seeing here are the trends in various human and ecological, mainly human here, these issues, human factors around the world. So if somebody presents you with a number, for example, that there are still nuclear warheads in the world, if they just present you with the number of nuclear warheads, 15,000 nuclear warheads, then you may say, that's terrible. We're doing a terrible job as a society, right? We're doing a terrible job as a global community. But if somebody then presents you with a number from 20 years ago, and then from 20 years before that, and they say, here's what the number was like before, then you will feel quite a bit different, and you might have a different perception, and you might even feel encouraged that we're doing well, let's continue to do well, instead of feeling like hopeless. There are still children who are doing labor every day. Lots of people die from disasters, but how does it look in comparison to the past? It's important to ask for a second number to get some kind of a frame of reference, right? Instead of framing everything in a certain way, we can frame it so that we get some kind of reference and we can understand the real situation. Another, this is from the people at Autodesk. I have a friend who works there, so I'm just showing it to show some of his work. So this is the confirmation bias example. We may look at this data set and assume that there's some kind of relationship based on what we see here. But in fact, or we may look at the data and say, look at the standard deviation and the Pearson R squared, right? There's a negative 0.06 relationship. That these statistics here on the left are true for all of these. This is the Anscombe's quartet, or the Datasaurus dozen. And the idea is that we may try to perceive something from this. We may have a confirmation bias that we have something we'd like to confirm by looking at these data, but there's not, in fact, any real strong relationship here. It's just our perception. And that's closely related to something called apophenia. Apophenia is when I draw some kind of a relationship in my mind. I look at this and I see a cluster. I see something going on. This is the clustering illusion. These are random points in this GIF just being generated on the plot. But what I do is I look for connections and meaningfulness. You can see this also when some people can see a face in the moon. They see a man in the moon. That's just part of our brains. We're looking for faces in things. So we see a face there. Some people do. Yeah, but of course, no one drew a face on the moon. And again, these are random points on this left-hand plot. So there is no relationship. But if, for example, the y-axis were margarine consumption and the x-axis were something else, heart disease or divorce, and I start to see some clusters here and there, I may start to tell because of my confirmation or because of apophenia, just seeing the clusters, I may come up with some relationships. I may draw some conclusions from this random data set. That is not the entire list of biases. And as of, I think this was made in 2016, as of 2016, the Creative Commons, a whole group of experts got together and they tried to make a codex of cognitive biases. This was not, at the time, was not complete, and it doesn't come close to representing what we know now for about this black box inside of our skulls. The more we learn about how this thing functions, the more we realize that we are not actually at the helm. We're not actually in control. This thing is basically a bias machine. So the more we're aware of that, the more we recognize that we are not so much in control, then we can take action, especially when we're building models and applying decision analysis tools. We can take that into account as we generate effective models that incorporate expert knowledge and incorporate uncertainty and are generated in a way that tries to overcome biases. And the way we do that is we apply debiasing techniques. And I like to use, to overcome confirmation bias and anchoring, I like to use group techniques. So I get multiple experts together. We adopt group processes, that is, bounce ideas off of each other, have a discussion. And actually groups, when we're talking about generating estimates, which we have to do for that Monte Carlo approach we talked about earlier, but also for Bayesian networks, groups can make better estimates by 20% or more. That's another fantastic book, Super Forecasting, by Philip Tetlock and Dan Gardner. Definitely recommend. And as we discussed earlier, when we were talking about Yu Shu and her work, you'll remember this quote, "The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing." It is important when we do use these group processes that we do it in a way that everyone has a voice somehow. And I follow something, you can check it out at designkit.org, some examples of this approach, but I use a structured conversational process that I call 1-2 Cafe. So it's a mix of several different methodologies. Basically, as we discussed before with the different plenary versus individual versus group work, I take groups of people, they're working on different parts of the topic, and I get them to mix and match ideas and provide some structure that is timing and everything to the process, and I get them to move around and share ideas across different platforms and try to generate these conceptual models of the different parts of a specific decision. So we get from this, you'll remember from the previous video, we get from this complex but rather messy, holistic understanding of the process to something that's hopefully a bit more like a directed acyclic graph, or a graph that shows us really which variables interact and how they affect each other. What's our decision variable and what's our expected outcome, and how are these various factors expected to influence that process. So to give you the specifics, I ask for 5 minutes usually. Everybody writes down on their own. They're sitting at this table of this specific question. They write down on their own. They create a new agreed list by having a discussion with their neighbor, and then all of the group together creates creates a group model, and they draw relationships and bubbles together. It takes about 30 minutes. But of course, this is just a rough guideline, and it can be dramatically different. And now in the Corona times, of course, we have to do a whole new approach for this. Some resources for these approaches that I've discussed. There's a methods guide that we wrote for the World Agroforestry Center in 2018. There's also, if you want to learn more about this R package, we've written a vignette, so a little process whereby you can follow the code and look at our process and see how to run. We simulate the cost effectiveness of controlled burning. And we also published a paper using the Bayesian networks. So that again, risk tool that I told you about, but any Bayesian network tool will work for this, and you could follow that. But we've also published this all open access, so you can check it all out. That was in Earth's Future, also in 2018. And when it comes to estimating our state of knowledge, we can think of the Monte Carlo approach, that generating or providing a distribution of our uncertainty, much like shooting the arrow. So we saw earlier how somebody might paint the bullseye around the arrow after they've shot. That is, if you give a single number. But here we shoot multiple arrows, so we give our distribution of uncertainty. It should contain the real value. And by real, I'm using air quotes here, because real, I mean the future value. But we shoot multiple arrows using the Monte Carlo. As model inputs, we need those estimates that reflect our state of uncertainty as probability distributions. And the thing is that most people aren't usually really good at estimating their confidence intervals because of all these biases, numbers of others as well, including overconfidence or anchoring. So when we want to estimate our state of knowledge, we need to think about precision versus accuracy. So this is accurate and precise, but if I ask somebody to provide me an estimate, it's most likely not going to be quite accurate and precise, but rather we tend to go toward accurate and imprecise. This is sometimes possible, but what happens very often is that people go for inaccurate and precise. That is, they think 70%, and I say, well, I need some uncertainty. I need you to express some kind of uncertainty about it. And then they might say, okay, 70.5% and 69.5%. So this is bad because they've missed the mark. What's probably most realistic is inaccurate and imprecise, right? If we really don't know the future market price of banana, but it's important to us, we need to make sure that the correct value is included somewhere in our model, then we may need a very wide distribution of uncertainty. And that may be a critical value, a critical variable for our model. It may not in the end. And what actually happens is that through calibration training, we're able to increase awareness of bias and the ability to estimate ranges. That's something we hear about from Doug Hubbard. I spoke about him in a previous video, but Doug Hubbard has a book called How to Measure Anything, and he covers a lot of these ideas about calibration training and how that works. But I think of it like this: calibration, in the same way that you would calibrate a tool that you might be using in the field or in the lab, right? You use an object that you're sure is a certain dimension, and you check your calipers in this case, and you say, okay, my calipers say this, but the object I'm aware is this other dimension. Therefore, these calipers have an uncertainty, right? There's some kind of correction I have to use in order to understand the units that the calipers are telling me about, because I've used this testing tool. And we have a tool like that. We run them through the calibration training. That is, we provide them with lots and lots of random questions for which they have to provide an estimate of their uncertainty, and we give them feedback. Here's how well you did, or here's where you messed up, or here's how well you're doing as a group. And we give them some tools for debiasing and for getting calibrated. And that's something we could do for your team as well. You just get in touch with us and we can go through a calibration training together. But that's a necessary step for every analyst and every person who's going to take part in generating one of these decision models. What we're eliciting, I just want to make a few points that are really clear. What we're eliciting is expert and not perfect opinions. That is, we don't get a perfect number, right? We don't get exactly 70%, or we're not certain that the distribution that we've got is absolutely containing the correct value, but rather that 9 times out of 10, if we're shooting for 90% confidence, 9 times out of 10, it contains the right value. And what expert knowledge can do for us is can capture information not adequately represented by observed data. That is, what about the nutrition implications of introducing a new fruit into society, right, into a certain community, may be affected by something unexpected or something really hard to measure, like whether people like this food, or how much people know about nutrition, how important is nutrition to people's dietary choices, whether or not, yeah, there are a whole number. I'm sure you can come up with a few factors that might make this a difficult. Might make certain things difficult to measure. So there are a number of factors that would be very hard to fit into a model. So what I'd like you to do now is to think about think back to your conceptual model that you drew earlier, and consider the variables inside this model that might be especially difficult to measure, and where something like calibration training might be effective for estimating, training some experts who are aware of the situation of this particular variable, and then training them calibrating them might be effective for generating this value. You can share with us in Slack. You can share with the rest of your team, and I look forward to hearing what you've come up with. See you in the next video.